Well, thank you, David, for a very handsome, ambivalent introduction. I still feel that I must begin by striking a slightly solemn chord. I hope it won't seem like a sententious one. I mean, in view of not just our geographical position on this coast, but in view of the fact that our society has recently both asked for and required the solidarity of so many other societies, I would like us to keep quiet for a moment and think about our Australian brothers and sisters and the obscene atrocity to which they've been subjected, and also to think about the root causes of that atrocity, which are the determination of some people not to coexist with civil society, and also the willingness of Australian soldiers to volunteer for the unhappy and belated, but ultimately delightful, independence of East Timor, an independence that was greeted by the Bin Ladenists and their allies as a crime against one of their favorite dictatorships. So, with that said, I would just entreat a moment of reflection. Thank you. And also of solidarity, in case there should be any Antipodean listeners to this show. I say show, even though it's me doing it. I thought I might begin by reading a poem, which is the introduction of my book on George Orwell. It's written by Robert Conquest, a distinguished local resident, a professor at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Orwell only lived to be 46. I went to Bob Conquest's 85th birthday last year and was amazed, as I say in my dedication to him, to be in the presence of such a great scholar and such a great man who has the rare quality of having been both a premature anti-fascist and a premature anti-Stalinist. A combination seldom met with in the same person, as well as a wonderful poet, a great critic, perhaps the great historian of the atrocities of the 20th century, and the man who has done the most, along with Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis in the last few decades, to keep the very difficult and intricate form of the limerick alive. Any one of these attainments, I think, might be enough for one lifetime. He, some years ago, wrote a poem about George Orwell, and to my boundless gratitude gave me permission to use it, and I'm going to requite that gratitude by, as people sometimes say in this area, sharing it with you. Moral and mental glaciers, melting slightly, betray the influence of his warm intent. Because he taught us what the actual meant, the vicious winter grips its prey less tightly. Not all were grateful for his help, one finds, for how they hated him, who huddled with the comfort of a quick remedial myth against the cold world and their colder minds. We die of words. For touchstones he restored the real person, real event or thing, and thus we see not war but suffering as the conjunction to be most abhorred. He shared with the great world for greater ends that honesty, a curious cunning virtue, you share with just the few who don't desert you. A dozen writers, half a dozen friends. A moral genius, and truth-seeking brings sometimes a silliness we view askance. Like Darwin playing his bassoon to plants, he too had lapses, but he claimed no wings. While those who drown a truth's empiric part in dithyramb or dogma turn frenetic, than whom no writer could be less poetic, he left this lesson for all verse, all art. If, in what I'm about to say, I can arise to anything like that standard of evocation, I shall be pleased for myself, and I hope you'll be pleased with my subject. I'm going to choose to begin in this way, and I hope not to be thought opportunistic. But in the last 7 days, we've been reminded very forcibly indeed, it seems to me, that the totalitarian principle That's to say, the principle which enslaves one society, the better to commit an aggression against others, is not something that we can confine to the perhaps compulsory study of 1984 and of Animal Farm, which is visited on school children in this country, but is a living, vivid, actual principle and a really clarifying threat. I'm referring first to the unspeakable degradation that was inflicted last week by their big brother on the people of Iraq, forced once again to gather adoringly, unanimously, and terrified, and not only to turn out to vote 100%, but to turn out to vote 100% the same way. After what they've been through, one felt they might have been spared this last Ceausescu-style abnegation, humiliation. And second, the discovery that the People's Republic of North Korea has all this time, while its people have been starving and screaming with hunger and pain and the absence of all culture, has been choosing to spend all its resources on the enrichment of uranium. Who will say in the face of this that the relevance of George Orwell belongs in the past? It so happens that I've been to both Iraq and North Korea. I'm up to speed on the Axis stuff, have been for some time. That in my book I write about my visit to Pyongyang in this way. In the closing months of the 20th century, I contrived to get a visa for North Korea, often referred to as the world's last Stalinist state. It might as easily be described as the world's prototype Stalinist state, founded under the protection of Stalin and Mao, and made even more hermetic and insular by the fact of a partitioned peninsula that, so to speak, locked it in. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea still boasted the following features at the end of the year 2000. On every public building, a huge picture of the great leader, Kim Il-sung, the dead man who still holds the office of president, in what one might therefore term a necrocracy or a mausolocracy. All other senior posts are occupied by his son, the dear leader, Kim Jong-il. After all, Big Brother, as a term, was a perversion of family values as well. Children march to school in formation, singing songs in praise of the aforesaid leader. Photographs of the leader displayed by order in every home. A lapel button with the features of the leader, compulsory wear for all citizens. Loudspeakers and radios blasting continuous propaganda for the leader and the party. A society endlessly mobilized for war, its propaganda both hysterical and, in reference to foreigners and foreign powers, intensely chauvinistic and xenophobic. Complete prohibition of any news from outside or any contact with any other countries. Absolute insistence in all books and all publications on a unanimous view of a grim past, a struggling present, and a radiant future. Repeated bulletins of absolutely false news, of successful missile tests or magnificent production targets. A pervasive atmosphere of scarcity and hunger, alleviated only by the most abysmal and limited food. Grandiose and oppressive architecture. A continuous stress on mass sports and mass exercise. Apparently total repression of all matters connected to the libido. Newspapers with no news, shops with no goods, an airport with almost no planes. A vast nexus of tunnels underneath the capital city, connecting different party and police and military bunkers. There was, of course, only one word for it, and it was employed by all journalists, all diplomats, and all overseas visitors. It's the only time in my writing life when I've become tired of the term Orwellian. I might add here to interpolate, I was in Czechoslovakia under the old communist police regime in the late 1980s, and I resolved while I was in Prague to become the first reporter to write an article from there, first writer to compose one, that wouldn't mention the name Franz Kafka. Like Mr. Amos, I believe in the war against cliché. And so what was my horror when I was arrested by the communist secret police at a meeting of the Charter 77 forces in a private apartment. And when I asked them, what is the charge, I was told, we're not telling you. I ended up mentioning Kafka after all in that piece. And having quit Pyongyang, I was obliged to use the word Orwellian. I'll just close by my last sentences on this. In some respects, the North Korean nightmare falls short of Orwell's dystopia. The regime is too poor and too inefficient to provide telescreens or even wireless sets to most of its subjects. In some respects, however, it is infinitely more forbidding. Winston and Julia would have had no chance at all for a moment of private delight in the countryside, let alone the lease of a crummy flat in some anonymous proletarian quarter of town. Nonetheless, there really are hate sessions in North Korea during breaks in factory or office work, and at an evening of mass games I was shown, via multiple hypnotizing flashcards, the hideous image of a grim-visaged enemy soldier hurtling towards me, to be replaced by the refulgent and reassuring face of the great leader. These are details. What was entirely unmistakable was the atmosphere of a society where individual private life is absolutely pointless, and where everything that is not absolutely compulsory is absolutely forbidden. The resulting dankness and dinginess and misery would have been almost indescribable without reference to a certain short novel that had been bashed out on an old typewriter against the clock by a dying English radical half a century before. So, I've started in a way at the opposite end of my answer to the question posed by my book jacket, which is, why does Orwell matter? Because I believe that to answer the question one has to begin a little earlier than his partly Swiftian and partly dystopian novels, his best-known work, and most often cited in the United States, 1984 and Animal Farm. The most concise way I can think of phrasing this is the following. In the century that's just closed behind us, or we rather hope has just closed behind us, the 20th century, the three great moral and political and cultural crises were these. The end of empire, the end of the idea that the world was the property, and the world and its inhabitants and resources were the property of white Europeans. The question of fascism and National Socialism, the threat to civilization that was posed by that, and the delusions of Stalinism. George Orwell, I propose, as the only writer, the only, some would say, public intellectual, the only person who managed to get all three of these questions right. And I'll just begin first by saying how he did that, or rather, how he phrased it, and then I'll say why I think how he did it. He was a British colonial official, having had a fairly standardized, what we call in England, conventional upbringing. We call it conventional because it applies to only about 5% of the population, I think, which is why we say public school when we mean private. It's another way of making Americans feel at home when they visit. Like a lot of other successful writers, he skipped university altogether, partly out of poverty, and became a colonial official, a police official, in fact, in Burma, and threw up the job for reasons that he never publicly stated, but I believe I understand from a close study of his writing. I think that he thought that if he kept on with the job, he would become a sadist, that he would become a robot, that he'd understood something very essential about what Nietzsche called the master-slave relationship, and also the other term that's often used rather cheaply, exploitation. It was one thing to notice that the British kept Burma forcibly underdeveloped in order that its economy would be a blood bank for the British economy. That was something, in a sense, any fool could see. But there was exploitation of another kind as well, and it took the following form. The most educated, the most integrated, the most sophisticated, the most qualified Indian or Burmese man, however anglicized he may have become, would never be allowed as a member of the English club to come and have lunch or dinner or a cocktail in a European company. That would never happen. But the least qualified and least literate and least assimilated Burmese woman could be allowed into any Englishman's bungalow, though only by the back door. In fact, Florey, the central character in Orwell's first novel, Burmese Days, and the man who I believe anticipates by some decades the sweltering, guilt-ridden anti-heroes of the later Graham Greene stories, actually says, admits to us through his author, that he bought his Burmese mistress from her family. That, in other words, he's living with a slave, a sex slave. These two declensions of exploitation, it seemed to Orwell, and it seems to me, condemned the system of imperialism morally as well as economically and politically. And his decision to refuse it and to become instead a campaigner against it, which now seems to us in retrospect to be rather commonsensical, if not morally obvious, was at the time he made it in the early 20s a very unusual decision indeed. It seemed to most people at that time that imperialism would last for many, many more generations, that it was rational and progressive and even liberal, and that it was a gift from Europe to the rest of the world. There were very, very few who saw that it had a short time to live and that this time should be, as far as possible, further curtailed by moral critique. And with that step, Orwell took the side of the underdog and the oppressed for the rest of his life. Never wavering in this, was determined as far as possible to share their suffering, to look at the world from their perspective. And I think that aided him very powerfully, first in understanding what is very present and vivid in the novelistic portrayals in 1984, the essential sadomasochistic quality of the master-slave relationship, the pornographic secret that is at the heart of domination, and to have understood that as someone who had been tempted by it the other way around. In other words, we're looking at a figure who knew what it would be like to hold the other end of the whip, to be the one wielding it rather than receiving it, and understood the ghastly temptations involved. In my opinion, the great test of any writer and any intellectual is their ability to handle contradiction. The reason why Orwell's prose retains for us the sinew and muscle that it does, and the tensile quality that it displays, is because we have a man arguing all the time with his own prejudices and his own fears, his own bigotries, his own shortcomings, trying to argue himself in public out of these temptations. Once that's clarified, I think it's very easy to see why he was so quick to detect the menace of fascism, the really pornographic assault on European civilization that began a decade or so later, and which also partook of the sadomasochistic and the cruel. And as Orwell was, again, very prescient in pointing out, took the doctrines of racism that had been evolved for purposes of colonial domination and did what he'd always feared they would do and began to apply them to other Europeans as well. It wasn't enough to describe other species of different colors as Untermenschen or natural slaves. This doctrine, the revolting, irrational doctrine, could also be applied to other Europeans. And like empire, it would mean war, not just in the sense of intending it, but in the sense of entailing it. And so he went to Spain and became one of the first volunteers to feel the weight of a pack and a rifle on his shoulder and to physically bar the road to war and fascism as it tried to conquer European civilization. And his account of that struggle, almost unpublished in his own lifetime because of the publishers who wouldn't take it or the editors who censored it or the people who wouldn't distribute it. Homage to Catalonia is still the most imperishable account of being both a volunteer and a reporter in a context of war and revolution. And it was while engaged in that struggle, as if he didn't have enough, so to speak, on his plate, that he became aware that there was a third great illusion or delusion or hallucination very prevalent among the intellectuals and those who imagined themselves to be emancipated, rational, and progressive. And this great delusion was the one which stated that beyond the Ural Mountains, in the far distant provinces of Stalin's Russia, a new utopia was being created where history would come to an end, where human emancipation would be consummated, there would be no more contradictions, and the ideal society would come to birth. And in trying to dispel this hallucination, and also in showing that more than a delusion, more than an illusion, it was a terrible lie and depended upon the suppression or distortion of some appalling truths, Orwell was forced to confront physically, as well as mentally and morally, the consensus of the enlightened, the bien-pensants, who, as some of you may have good reason to know, are always the most intolerant people in society, because they're sure that they're right, and they're sure that their motives must be ideal. And the last decade of his life is therefore spent in an imperishable struggle, conducted almost entirely as an individual, armed really only with a typewriter and an attitude, against the trahison d'éclat, against the betrayal by society and its values, its highest values. So of society and its highest values, by its intellectuals. Now, any of those three things, it seems to me, would be enough for one lifetime. But I must add, before I trespass on your time, which I think I'm about to do, and I have a sense of an unspoken message coming from I know. I must say why I must briefly say why I think one lone stubborn Englishman was able to do this, was enabled to do it, and I will select the following as my provisional conclusion. With some part of himself, and with his long wrestling with love of literature and of the liturgy, he was a convinced atheist, I think, by the way, a Protestant atheist, but still an atheist. You may know the joke from Belfast about the roadblock. Man gets stopped. Well, what religion are you? Oh, well, I'm an atheist. Are you a Protestant atheist or a Catholic atheist? Actually happened to a Jewish friend of mine in Belfast, and used to make the life of Chinese waiters in Belfast very difficult too in the days of the roadblock. He had a strong belief in the long struggle to have the Bible translated out of Latin, where it was the possession of a priestly class, or, if you prefer the analogy of 1984, of the members of the inner party, a secret book with knowledge arcane and limited to an elite, where it could be read and understood by the people. The long struggle of the Protestant Revolution, where men like William Tyndale were strangled and burned for the right to have a Bible that the congregation could read too. With all these things, he understood intuitively what I think has now been confirmed, shall we say scientifically, that there is a connection between language and truth and logic, that there is innate in us an instinct for language that makes us human, and that along with that comes the wish for clarity and honesty of expression, that it matters, in other words, not what you think. I've just given you three examples of how his opinions were the right ones, and that's quite a different thing. Saying or believing the right thing. It's not what you think, it's how you think. It's whether you are willing to trust in what is innate in us in the struggle for liberty and the distrust of lies, the distrust of propaganda, distrust of authority, the lie of authority and the folded lie in the brain, as Auden puts it in his wonderful poem, September 1939. In understanding this, I think, he made it clear that one individual, if possessed of a love of language, an understanding of literature, and a respect for truth, can prevail in a time when the mind is in chains and when people's will to obey, people's willingness to accept coercion has temporarily eclipsed their will to resist. And since it seems to me that we're never likely to reach a time or a place where that example won't be of the first importance to us, and since we happen to be in such a time and such a place now, and since there is so much fear around us and so much propaganda in the language to which we're compelled to listen, that I won't detain you any longer in saying why I think that my title, Why Your Will Matters, is in that extent at least its own justification. So with great gratitude to you for inviting me, and to you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming, I'll place myself at your disposal. Thank you. Shall I stay here?
Our thanks to Christopher Hitchens, journalist and author of Why Orwell Matters, for his comments here today. I'm Connie Shapiro, president of the Commonwealth Club, and I will conduct the question and answer section of this program. We have many questions, so if you would step back up here, I will begin. What would Orwell write about today?
Well, I would have thrown that one out because can I winnow the rest of them? No, I'm just kidding. Well, I think I began by saying what I thought he would already have known and would have hoped to make plain to others about the survival into our time of the party state, of the idea of the leader-worshipping, centrally organized, regimented society, economy, and political system, and how the existence of such regimes is not just a tragedy for those who live under them, but a menace to those who live alongside them or have to temporarily coexist with them. I think that that he would have noticed that. Then I think he would have noticed in his struggle for truth and language that I was just mentioning, probably the best known lesson that he taught, and the one that people have assimilated the best, is the attack on euphemism. Pretty names for ugly things, in other words. Thus, I suppose the contemporary classic would be collateral damage as a word for dead civilians. Most people I know, I'm very pleased to say, when they hear a trick like that attempted to be pulled on them, will reach for their Orwell. Somewhere in themselves they know he put them on alert for a thing like that. Of course, they're often not as alert to it in their own discourse. For example, facile anti-war people now say no war on Iraq or no war with Iraq. Well, that sounds okay, but since the argument is should there be a fight with Saddam Hussein, it's doing no favor to the Iraqi people to say that Iraq is Saddam or Saddam is Iraq. After all, that's the proposition the Iraqi people were asked to validate in a 100% referendum last week. So people who say Iraq when they mean Saddam Hussein are doing his work for him and should be aware of it. So it's one thing to be aware of the lies that power tells in surreptitious propaganda, but one must also be aware of the facile or evasive things that one is inclined to say or let be said oneself.
Do you feel, as Orwell did in his time, that the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world?
Well, Orwell wrote that when he realized that what he'd set down in Homage to Catalonia was going to be believed by nobody, that he was never going to be able to publish his findings about the attempt by Stalin to destroy the Spanish Republic, and that to the extent he could publish them, even in small magazines, he wouldn't be believed. And that the people who he knew who were witnesses were all either dead or in prison or on the run. And he said, it will come to a point where what the leader says is true. And if he says it didn't happen in the past, it didn't happen then either, let alone now. And of course, you can see there the germ, the nucleus of 1984 occurring to him. So it's a very suggestive excerpt from his work. All I can say is that we now have the archives from Moscow and from Salamanca, the archives of the General Franco regime, open to us, and it can now be independently confirmed and verified that every single assertion he made in that book is true. He said, all I know is what I saw, and when I didn't see it myself, I'm quoting people who I think are honest and reliable, but I can do no better than that. Well, and he thought it wouldn't work. Well, it does work, has worked, he has been vindicated, and there's now a square named for him in Barcelona that was opened by the mayor of Barcelona a couple of years ago, Plaza George Orwell. And he might even have lived to see it. So I think what one must say is that even though there are people, of course, of another school now, sometimes I think rather glibly called the postmodernist, who deny that there's such a thing as objective truth anyway, or verifiability in any case, who have an affectless attitude towards reality. But whose tyranny is not anything like the same. They only wear people down by boredom and semi-literate prose, rather than by boredom, semi-literate prose and machine guns and rubber truncheons and concentration camps. But that it's right to assume that it will always be a struggle, that there will never be a point where everyone understands, as it were, what objectivity and truth is, and that these are given or a priori. No, you get what you fight for with that, as you do with rights.
One of Orwell's last writings was, the problem with the left is that it tells lies about its past. Given your recent departure from the nation, is this a sentiment with which you concur?
Well, I certainly don't think that the nation as a magazine, tells lies about the past or indeed about the present. I think it has illusions about both, but individuals there do, and the editorial style tends in that direction. But it would be false of me to say that this was if it was a campaign of lies, it would be easy to expose. It's rather, I think, a campaign of comforting half-truth, such as the possibility of being neutral in a war between civil society and theocratic aggression. I don't think there is a neutral position there, and I'm rather glad that there isn't, because I rather relish the confrontation. But there are people who think that there is a mid or neutral position, that one can be morally neutral about it, and there are even some who I think are a little, shall I say, euphemistic about the other side, are willing to grant more for it or more to it than it claims for itself. For example, the idea that Osama bin Laden is an anti-imperialist when he wants to restore the caliphate. I don't grant to someone who wants to restore the caliphate that he's a hater of empire. I'm sorry, I won't do it. Or that he's a revolutionary when he's in fact a hired pimp for the Saudi Arabian oligarchy and the Pakistani secret police, and his organization is partly a crime family, partly a bent multinational corporation, and partly a fascist Camarilla. So anyone who thinks that's radicalism is entitled to their delusion, but not. I want no. By refusing to work anymore for the nation, I simply announce to myself, more than anyone else, but to others if they're interested, that I want no part of any of that.
Continuing on the subject of the nation, this person writes, "You quit the nation because they are anti-war. Don't you want to be the voice of reason there? Will Navrosky take you back if you say, 'Pretty please'?"
Well, I hope no one would think I was being evasive if I said I thought I'd answered that question. I might add, though, that of course the nation never tried to alter anything I said, and were sweet in saying they wished I wouldn't go. I suppose I might add one thing: being anti-war is okay as long as people are pacifist. I mean, if someone says, "I'm a Quaker and I would rather die than hurt Osama bin Laden," I can respect that position. But people who are not pacifists, and in fact are secret sympathizers of the other side, and inventors of excuses for them, shouldn't say that they're anti-war. I'm afraid that, as I said before, Orwell does not just expose the euphemisms and propaganda of power. He exposes the glibness and fatuity of all of us. And it's for everyone to look to their own language. And people who say they're anti-war, if they are Ramsey Clark, for example, let me just do this, okay? We'll have it out of the way. There was a petition the other day, which some of you saw, probably, called "Not in My Name," addressed to the president, all the people who don't want a confrontation with Saddam Hussein. And there were various names on it. Marisa Tomei was one, Ed Asner was another. I actually don't think George Bush is going to war in the name of Marisa Tomei, but she may as well say that. Now, whether they know it or not, this petition is put together by a front organization for the Workers' World Party called the International Action Center, whose chair, Ramsey Clark, is chairman of the International Committee to Defend Slobodan Milosevic. And I'm sorry, that's not pacifism. It's not anti-war. It's a lie to say that, and anyone who believes it is a sap, and that has to be said as often as possible.
Will you be doing a monthly column in any other magazine?
Well, I see we're not going to leave this. They did ask me at one. There came a point when the divine Katrina, the fragrant and gorgeous Katrina, and the furry Nowacki, in our conversations, they did say rather huskily, "Is there anybody else?" And I said, "No, there isn't anybody else." And at that time, I meant it too. It was true.
Has the advent of the computer drawn us closer to Big Brother watching us?
Well, you're asking very much the wrong person, because I only know how to use the computer really as a typewriter and a telephone. But my instinct is to say no. I remember during the Tiananmen Square events in early 1989, that once I'd been able to take my eyes off Henry Kissinger justifying the massacre on television, though I have never forgotten him doing so. I don't think anyone else should. I was amazed that on my recently acquired fax machine, I could get direct, people from Tiananmen Square were sending out faxes. I thought, that's amazing. Censorship is now impossible. I mean, I've been in countries, I had before been in countries as a writer, where I couldn't transmit from where I was what I'd found out, unless with great luck. Maybe finding the right telex operator or getting someone who was flying out on a plane to take it. But you could be there and unable to communicate. I thought, in a way, censorship has been abolished now. No government can say it controls information. Well, of course, we've evolved hugely beyond the fax now with email, and though that encourages the state to try and find means of keeping a surveillance of it and some control, I think we have reached a point that Orwell would never have predicted or been able to predict, where it's possible to say that censorship is only really a Platonic concept now. It's a wish in the mind of the state and of the authorities, but almost nobody now depends upon orthodox sources of information. Probably the best thing that's happened in my working lifetime.
In politics and the English language, Orwell goes after those who would use language to cover up rather than reveal. Within universities, are we making progress toward teaching students to think and write clearly?
Well, I can only speak for the classes that I teach myself at the New School in New York, and I know that they come there. This is a graduate class at the Liberal Studies Department. Most of these graduates come for remedial treatment because they know that they've been betrayed by their education so far. They've neither been taught to think nor to read. And so I don't know what's going on. I don't know what happened to them before they got this far, but I know they're in trouble if they're coming to me. And if they're willing, as it were, to seek help. That's stage one, of course. Admit you have a problem. If it's that bad, it must be very bad. And I also know that it ought to be easier than it is. Out of, say, there would be a probable 15 in a first class. The first meeting that we had, the struggle to find a reference and an allusion, a literary allusion that they'll all get, that everyone will understand, so there'll be a common reference point, is increasingly difficult and dispiritingly so. And actually, George Orwell is one of the few handholds, but that's only because he's been inculcated in school for a long time, basically as part of the instruction in the orthodoxy of the Cold War. And that, of course, is to do him and his work a huge disservice. But at least it means that, yes, along with Huck Finn, The Catcher in the Rye, The Simpsons, and usually Gatsby, everyone's read it. But after that, you can't trust a thing. And this, it seems to me, is a terrible cultural disgrace. And it comes from praising students for working so well and doing so well and being so good, and everyone wins a prize and everyone's great. And the worst thing is to upset anybody. Well, they don't get that for coming to me either.
In November 1989, a group of university students in Czechoslovakia were preparing a stage performance of Animal Farm when the system finally crumbled. How much delusion do leaders in North Korea and Iran live under?
To mention another great resident of this area, excuse me, I've already mentioned Robert Conquest. I could give you the example of Czesław Miłosz, who I suppose we would now have to say was in every sense the laureate of Poland, poetic and literary, who's been living in Berkeley for a long time. And in 1951, he wrote The Captive Mind. He was then still a cultural official in the Stalinized party that ran Poland. 1951 is the year after Orwell died, and 1984 was published. And in The Captive Mind, Miłosz writes that within certain circles within the Polish communist leadership, this book, 1984, was passed from hand to hand in illicit translation by people who trusted one another as, have you read this? And they were all astounded by how it described and captured the texture of life in a closed society And he adds, Miłosz adds, they were all astounded later to find that the author, the English author of this, had never lived under the Stalinism or even visited the Soviet Union. In that case, how does he know how it feels? How does he know how it smells and tastes? Now, remember, Miłosz is discussing passing a book from hand to hand, a secret book within the inner party. The book is 1984, which is about the passing of a secret book from hand to hand within the inner party 1 year after it's written, and hasn't been published in most of the West. It's the people in Poland got the point right away. I don't think any one writer in the century has ever paid a greater compliment to another, even if it's unintentional, than that. And so, yes, of course people do know. Of course they do know. We're all mammals. There's nothing racially or genetically different between ourselves and North Koreans, Albanians, Iraqis, and so on. Everyone has a rough sense of when they're being lied to, and when they're being got at, or coerced, or exploited. The bet we take that the right bet would be on their emancipation must be the right one. The bet we take that their leaders deserve better treatment must be the wrong one. Always has been the wrong one. I would add only that actually Orwell had, though he'd never been to Stalin's Russia, he did have an idea of what a totalitarian society could be made up of, because he'd been a victim of a very sadistic colonial English boys' school when he was very small. He'd been a colonial policeman. He'd been subject to a purge and a witch hunt in Spain, and he'd seen how easy it was to control the colonial subjects and the unemployed with only a few determined officials. So in fact, by summarizing everything he had learned in his other struggles, he was able to make a reasonable guess. Again, because of anthropomorphic ability, if you will, of what this kind of thing might be like. And we, I think, are entitled to do our best to do the same.
Do you feel like a lefty these days? It seems like many countries have drifted towards libertarianism.
Well, I wish with the question I want to stand up and say who's drifting towards libertarianism. It would cheer me up. It doesn't seem to me like that. I wish it did. Unless the questioner means, which he may or she may, that there's a generally widespread admission that the dirigiste economy, whether merely stageified and partified or semi-nationalized, has suffering from diminishing returns. I mean, that's, I suppose, generally true, and that may go to the point of whether one feels like a leftist or not.
What I meant was,
Gotcha.
it's kind of like
Thought they might flush him out.
I've been a fan of the comedian Dennis Miller for a long time.
I don't know if the tape will pick that up. Should I be your ventriloquist? The comrade says that he's been a fan of Dennis Miller for a while. Profanely, he calls a comedian rather than a philosopher and satirist, as he really is. And he's noticed that, having at one point been a sort of farouche 60s enragé, these are my words, but he's now more of a libertarian type. Yeah, I'd noticed the same thing. And I think it would be true of me in some ways too, yes, if that's what you meant, sure. But when I work, as I have been recently, with the Kurdish rebel opposition or the Iraqi underground, I feel much more like a Trotskyist, as I used to, much more than I would if I was carrying a placard around the street saying, "Give Saddam Hussein another chance." I don't see how anyone can do that and call themselves a leftist. I'm sorry. Not while I'm around. They can't anyhow.
On a September 11th related question, do you find any significance between Louis Freeh, former FBI director's disdain for the Clinton administration, his resignation right before September 11th, and the frustrated resignation from FBI and subsequent death of FBI agent Joe O'Neill?
Well, I know both the stories quite well, and it would take a while to summarize the O'Neill one for anyone who doesn't know it, but I'll do it in a sentence. I think Mr. O'Neill had become persuaded a long time previously that the al-Qaeda network was a serious threat and was being consistently underestimated by the administration, and made himself obnoxious inside the Bureau by making this point and saying that there was a cover-up involved, say, in Yemen with the USS Cole, a general underestimation of the threat. He then made the crucial mistake of leaving some secret documents in his briefcase in a hotel in a conference in Florida, which gave his enemies an excuse to fire him for a breach of security. And he said, well, the hell with you anyway. I can get a better job in the public sector and in the private sector, and I'll carry on my campaign from there. And on the 1st of September of 2001, became Director of Security for the World Trade Center, and was last seen entering Tower 2. It's the nearest I've ever got in real life in a study to the Sherlock Holmes Moriarty global mutual combat, where unfortunately only one of them falls into the Reichenbach so far. Though I actually think, for other reasons, we won't be hearing from Mr. bin Laden again. I think he's under the rock. I'm digressing only a little, I hope. Certainly there was nobody who took the struggle against Islamic fascism seriously could have been content with the performance of the Clinton administration, which didn't take it seriously, was culpably neglectful of it, and in its one counterstroke, alleged counterstroke, committed an atrocity by blowing up a civilian facility in Sudan on presidential order on the pretext that it was a nerve gas facility, but without demanding an inspection. Note well. If it was a nerve gas facility, it could hardly have been folded like a tent and moved into the desert, could it? No inspection was required, no warning was given, no reference to the United Nations was made or to Congress. Every liberal in the country forgives Mr. Clinton for that. I don't. It had the paradoxical effect, I call it paradoxical anyway, of making Mr. bin Laden look good. A pretty difficult task in the context. No, well, as with the whole 8 years of Mr. Clinton in foreign policy, those years were eaten by the locust at best, and these were 8 years we couldn't have afforded. So Mr. Free and Mr. O'Neill didn't get near, I think, criticizing how unbelievably squalid and pointless that period in American political life really was. And how unself-critical its supporters, by the way, still are. They still think they're only a Florida recount away from having been proved right. What can you do with such people? I leave the question with you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters.
You've written a book calling for criminal charges against Henry Kissinger. Recently, however, the U.S. sought to exempt American officials, not just American soldiers, from the International Court of Criminal Justice. How does this affect the effort to bring Kissinger to justice?
Well, in the following way, that's, I think, of great moment, and I say that quite independent of my own campaign. Though, I'll just tell you, in case you want an update, that since the book came out and since the campaign began, Henry Kissinger was visited by the gendarmerie in Paris in the Ritz Hotel and summoned to a court to answer questions about Pinochet and the disappearance of French people in that terrible immolation, and fled town. But the warrant is still extant for when he comes back. He's been sought for questioning by the magistrates in Chile, where I've been to testify against him, Judge Guzman, the main judge in the Pinochet case, and Judge Rodolfo Corral, the main judge in the death squad case in Argentina, is also seeking his testimony. An attempt was made to have a judge issue a bench warrant for his arrest in London quite recently, and will be repeated if he tries to return there. The Brazilian government asked him to cancel an official visit to Brazil a few weeks ago on the grounds that his immunity from prosecution couldn't be guaranteed. Some of the oxygen from around the guy is being sucked out, I'm glad to say. And he's not free to travel anywhere without consulting lawyers each time, and there are some countries he wouldn't dare go to. And there's some I haven't mentioned where it's self-evident he wouldn't try and take a holiday in any case. So this is not good enough, but it's a start. In other words, something like a consistent human rights ethic of international law touching war crimes and crimes against humanity is beginning to apply to him. He's also being sued in federal court in Washington, D.C. by the relatives of people who were murdered on his orders in Chile. Unfortunately, that suit was filed on the 11th of September 2001 and hasn't had all the coverage I would have liked for it, but we are working on it. Now, very importantly, and to answer your question, the lady's question more directly, or the gentleman's question, in a recent long article by Elizabeth Becker in the New York Times and in some other reportage that's come into print in the legal journals, it's been made very clear by senior members of the administration that their reason for wanting to withdraw the American signature from the International Criminal Court is the protection of Henry Kissinger. That they are aware that this could be a grave embarrassment to the Republican Party and to the Bush administration, and as they think, because they want to implicate all of us in his crimes, the United States. Now, think about that for one thing. Think about the insult that that involves for American society, American culture, for everyone here who pays taxes or votes. But it's much worse than that. Think about what they haven't done for Saddam Hussein. What's the obvious thing the US administration should have done by now? It should have asked for his indictment for war crimes and crimes against humanity, asked its ambassador at the United Nations to lodge this complaint with the UN Human Rights Committee, or perhaps made an application to The Hague for a warrant for his arrest. It's the first thing you would think that a government bent on regime change would do. Why haven't they done it? Because they can't do it. Because they've thrown away, to defend Kissinger, they've thrown away a weapon that could have punished Saddam Hussein. Thus, Henry Kissinger helps to protect Saddam Hussein. This is not an irony or a contradiction. It's what you would expect, because those of us who believe in a consistent human rights ethic and a consistent international law ethic would obviously have got them both by now. If you're not going to get both, you have to be against getting either. So the consequences of this are unbelievably serious. And it seems to me that anyone of you who knows who their congressman is, or even their senator, should be making a fantastic stink about it, because the protection of Henry Kissinger is endangering civilization in a very direct sense, even more than his protection was an offense to it before now. This is we are really playing for real with all this. This is not rhetorical talk anymore. All of these things matter very much, and it's a gigantic responsibility, both of these cases, that's fallen upon American society and isn't being properly discharged.
Is the American public's willingness to give up or restrict their civil liberties a short-term dementia?
It's never clear to me whether people know how much they've given up. For example, if a lawyer now wants to arraign somebody and have them held indefinitely, and increase the charge of their conviction, the chance, of their conviction, on, let's say, at best circumstantial evidence, the main resort of prosecutors now is not to anything that Attorney General Ashcroft has recently done. The main resort is to what's called the Effective Death Penalty and Anti-Terrorism Act. It was passed by almost the whole Congress under the initiative of President Clinton a few years ago, which, as you may remember, also enormously increased the number of offences for which the death penalty could be applied and very greatly shortened the appeal process, if not abolished it in many cases. Nobody noticed that going by because it was considered to be a necessary law and order measure for the re-election of President Clinton to a second term. People who will give up their civil liberties for reasons like that, for reasons as short-term and opportunist and cheap as that one, are obviously going to be pretty easy to stampede when planes full of human beings have flown into buildings full of human beings. But let's not be in any doubt as to where this rot set in or for who is responsible for it.
Do you think we are becoming a society of sociopaths?
I sometimes get asked, or I did until recently, because I'd written books against people like Clinton, Mother Teresa, Henry Kissinger, so isn't there anyone you like? And now I can say, well, I've written this book about someone I think is rather good, George Orwell. So maybe I'm not as gloomy a person as you think, or as negative, but I must say all your questions are very depressing. Couldn't we have an upbeat question? No, we're not. We're not. But I think by no means is the United States becoming a society of sociopaths, or is in any danger of doing so. I'm afraid, though, that the traditions of generosity and tolerance and pluralism and non-judgmentalism, all of which are in their way as civilized accomplishments, are sometimes used to negate themselves. Are used to make people think, well, perhaps I'm not right in thinking that some people are bad and some people are good. Some people should be shot and some people should be spared. Who would I be to make that call? I wrote a piece in this weekend's Washington Post saying George Bush made a terrible mistake by saying that Saddam Hussein and Kim Jong-il were evil, because every educated, thoughtful, tender-minded liberal knows how to titter at such moral absolutism. We all know how to snigger. Evil, ha! He's painting it in black and white. We all know how to jeer at that. What he should have said is, attacking Saddam Hussein would be the lesser evil. Then every liberal would have been eating out of his hand. Lesser evilism we can do. We can name evil. We have the concept all right, but we only mention it in order to make accommodations with it. Now you're talking. Much better than cowboy rhetoric, isn't it? Or is it? How sure are you of that? Better be sure. The question is whether you have the fortitude, the self-confidence, and I would say the self-respect to say your own culture is worth fighting for, and that its enemies must be defeated. Some people really feel that they're being kind of judgmental if they say that.
Our thanks to Christopher Hitchens, journalist and author.